Section 20. Rehabilitation Act and Housing and Community Development Act. Today's Fair Housing Rules and Regulations, 2026 Standard. Introduction. When federal funding changes the rules. As we move forward from Section 19, where we covered violations, enforcement, and the legal consequences of non-compliance, we now step into another critical layer of fair housing law, federally funded housing, and the additional legal responsibilities that come with it. This section builds directly on everything you've learned so far. You already understand the Fair Housing Act and ADA requirements, but now we introduce two additional laws that apply when federal money is involved. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and Section 109 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. In 2026, this is where many real estate professionals, developers, and property managers get caught off guard, because once federal funding enters the transaction, compliance doesn't just continue, it expands. The big picture. Why these laws exist. To understand how these laws work, imagine a developer building a low-income housing project using federal grant money. The moment federal funding is introduced, that project becomes subject to additional oversight and regulation. These laws are designed to ensure that housing supported by public funds is accessible, inclusive, and free from discrimination. In simple terms, if federal money is involved, higher standards apply, and compliance is no longer optional. It is expected and enforced. What housing is covered, the federal funding trigger. Unlike the Fair Housing Act, which broadly applies to most housing, the Rehabilitation Act and Housing and Community Development Act apply specifically to housing or activities that are funded, even partially, with federal money. This includes low-income housing developments, subsidized rental programs, HUD-assisted housing, and projects built using federal grants. A key concept in 2026 is that even partial funding triggers full compliance, meaning the entire project, not just a portion, must meet these legal standards. Section 109, Reinforcing Equal Treatment. Section 109 of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 reinforces the core principles of fair housing by prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, or sex. While these categories mirror the Fair Housing Act, Section 109 specifically applies to federally funded housing and requires strict, equal treatment in all aspects of housing. This means that individuals cannot be treated differently in leasing, eligibility requirements, access to amenities, or placement within a property. For example, a property manager cannot assign certain groups to specific floors or buildings, as that would be considered segregation and a direct violation. The standard is simple but strict. Members of protected classes must be treated exactly the same as everyone else, with no variation or exception. Section 504, Expanding Disability Protections. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 takes these protections a step further by focusing specifically on individuals with disabilities. Under this law, discrimination based on disability is prohibited in federally funded housing, and housing providers must ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal access and opportunity. Disability is broadly defined to include physical or mental impairments that substantially limit major life activities such as walking, seeing, hearing, working, or learning. This connects directly to earlier sections on aided compliance, but with an important distinction. Section 504 applies specifically to federally funded housing programs and requires both accessibility and accommodation. Accessibility requirements, equal opportunity in practice. Under Section 504, accessibility is not just encouraged, it is required to the extent necessary to provide equal opportunity. Housing providers must ensure that accessible units are available throughout the property and not isolated in one location. For example, accessible units should be distributed across multiple floors in buildings with elevators and across different buildings in a multi-building complex. Common areas such as lobbies, hallways, pools, and fitness centers must also be accessible. The purpose of this requirement is to prevent segregation and ensure that individuals with disabilities have the same housing choices and experiences as other residents. Reasonable accommodations, a required adjustment. In addition to physical accessibility, Section 504 requires housing providers to make reasonable accommodations when necessary for a person with a disability to use and enjoy the property. This includes modifying policies, practices, or services. For example, Allowing a guide dog in a no-pet property or providing a reserved parking space for a tenant with mobility limitations would be considered reasonable accommodations. However, not every request must be granted. If an accommodation creates an undue financial or administrative burden or fundamentally alters the nature of the business, it may be considered unreasonable. Even in those cases, providers are expected to explore alternative solutions when possible. Understanding the limits. Equal access, not absolute access. It is important to understand that the law does not require every unit or building to be fully accessible. Instead, it requires that there be enough accessible housing and accommodations to ensure equal opportunity. This means that while complete accessibility across all units may not be required, the overall housing environment must allow individuals with disabilities to participate fully and equally. This distinction is critical in 2026, where compliance is measured by opportunity and access, not perfection. The pattern: layered laws and increased responsibility. At this point in the course, you should recognize how these laws fit together. The Fair Housing Act provides broad anti-discrimination protections, the ADA addresses accessibility in public spaces, and Section 504 and Section 109 add additional requirements when federal funding is involved. These laws do not replace each other. They layer together, creating a more comprehensive legal framework. As a result, professionals working with federally funded housing must meet higher standards and demonstrate a deeper understanding of compliance. Bringing it all together. The 2026 Compliance Standard. In today's real estate environment, working with federally funded housing means taking on greater responsibility. Whether you are dealing with HUD properties, subsidized housing, or government-backed developments, you are expected to apply all fair housing principles while also ensuring accessibility and equal treatment under these additional laws. This includes recognizing when federal funding is involved, understanding how multiple laws apply simultaneously, and guiding clients to make compliant decisions. The takeaway is clear. Once federal funding enters a transaction, the margin for error becomes smaller, the expectations become higher, and the consequences become more significant. In 2026, the most successful real estate professionals are those who not only understand these layered requirements, but can apply them confidently in real-world situations. Online discussion. Question 1. When do Section 504 and Section 109 apply to housing? Answer: when the housing or activity is funded, even partially, with federal money. Question 2. What is the main purpose of Section 504? Answer: to prevent discrimination based on disability and ensure equal access and reasonable accommodations in federally funded housing. Question 3. Why must accessible units be distributed throughout a property? Answer: to prevent segregation and ensure equal housing opportunities for individuals with disabilities.